Hi there. Okay, how many of you can hear me? Everybody hear me? Yes or no? All right, good. I can see now how we can have issues because I was trying to log on, and as I was trying to do that, Firefox decided they had to do an update. So I had a hard time getting here. But what we want to do tonight is we're in lab 11, but I wanted to refresh your memory about the brain. And so everybody that's online, if you can at least have your, tonight, I don't mind, have your audio and video. So I'd like to see some faces because I want to be able to see if you're able to follow. So I brought a brain. Obviously, we got a brain here. So let's refresh our memory about the different lobes and what they do, because we'll be talking about the cranial nerves, and we'll be talking about different parts of the brain or different functions. So we have a frontal lobe. In the frontal lobe, we have in the prefrontal lobe our intellect, our ability to think, our personality, our ability to be rational, our ability to be artistic, and it basically is your personality and your learning ability. On one side is called Broca, B-R-O-C-A. It's Broca's speech area. It'll allow me to form words and move my tongue and the muscles so I can speak. So that's Broca's speech. This area here in the front is called the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe, obviously, we remember M and S, motor cortex. So any nerve that has something to do with a muscle or movement of somatic, my arms, I need to use the frontal cortex, the motor cortex. On the parietal, just behind this gyrus, is the parietal lobe, and any sensation or ability to perceive some sensory has to be parietal. And then what did we say about the occipital lobe? What was back here? Anybody remember what the occipital lobe does? I have vision. I use my eyes are in the front of my head, but where is the occipital lobe and what does it actually do? Anybody? Look at your notes from last time. What's there? The occiput is for what? Anybody? Go ahead. Go ahead, Corey. What is it? Do you remember? Does anyone remember?
Vision.
Vision. So yeah, holler it out. So vision is in the back. Where is hearing? Remember, your ear's on the side. My temporal lobe is on the side. Where's hearing? Where?
Your temporal lobe.
Temporal lobe. And I believe also, so when we start looking at different things, you're going to need to know this because this is, part of what we're going to be filling out today. Let's open up the brain. And when you open up the brain, we have different parts. There were a couple areas that were called the primitive brain. Remember the brain stem? And so we talked about the area here where the spinal cord is. That's what we're going to talk about today. But we said there was one area where it became wide. It became oblong. So we called it the medulla oblongata. Oblongata. And then this area that looks like an almond, it was the what? Pons. And if we're looking at this area here, here's my pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is going to produce hormones that have some effect on metabolism, my, how warm I am. Growth hormone is produced here. Hormones that are related to reproduction are here. Okay, and then above it is the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus controls the pituitary. Above that is a relay station to the cortex called the thalamus. Behind in this area is called the midbrain. So this kind of refreshes our memory. This was the corpus callosum, and it connects the left side of the brain and the other, and allows us to multitask. And I said that it is built, or it's bigger in females. It's more developed in females because females, Seth, can do 5 things at once, and we can only do 1 thing at once, and maybe not even good at 1 thing, right? But women can do like 5 things, and it's true. So when you look at this corpus callosum, it's there. And in women, it's more developed. What's this in the back? Anybody? What's this area in the back? Go ahead, holler out. Does anyone recall? Go ahead. Corey, what is this? I can't hear you. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I don't know, the dura mater or something. I don't know.
All right, how about cerebellum?
Mhm.
So this is the cerebellum. And so we said that there were ventricles in the brain. Okay, ventricles are areas where there's like cavities, and cerebral spinal fluid is made there. Somebody tell me what cerebral spinal fluid does. Anybody? Because I need your help.
It helps the brain float.
Yeah, it floats the brain, but what does it bring to and from the brain?
Nutrients.
Nutrients, and some of those nutrients I need to breathe, so I'm bringing what kind of gas to my brain?
Oxygen.
Oxygen, and what am I taking away?
Nitrogen.
Well, how about another gas that's real important? It's carbon dioxide, right? So we're taking gases to and from. And so those are some of the areas that we need to know of the brain. All right, why am I doing this? If you're having a hard time looking at some of these areas and not knowing what they are, we have a test in like 2 weeks, okay? And so I was just putting together, one of the reasons why I was a little delayed getting on tonight is I was putting questions together on the cranial nerves. And so what we're supposed to do tonight, if we can take the assignment that you have for tonight, there's like 4 pages. The first one is dealing with basically the spinal cord. So there's all these terms we need to know. So we're going to talk about them, and then I have a model. So what we're going to have, dura, is an outer covering of the spinal cord or nerves. But they don't want that. The first one is epidural space. It's the space outside of the dura, and that's D. So D is the area of fat outside the spinal cord, and it cushions the spinal cord. There's 3 what they're called meninges or layers: dura, arachnoid, and pia. The dura is the hard outer part. That's G. Outermost protective layer. The middle layer is called arachnoid, which means spider. And so it has what looks like spider webs in it, and that's why there's a space just below that layer called the subarachnoid space. But the second layer is called the arachnoid layer, F, middle protective layer. And then there's a layer right on the spinal cord called the pia, P-I-A, pia mater. Pia mater is intimately on the spinal cord itself. The spinal cord looks like a butterfly. And so you have the 2 wings, and in the middle is an isthmus with a little hole. The little hole is called a central canal. And cerebral spinal fluid goes through that little central canal of the spinal cord. Of the butterflies, part of the butterfly structure are called horns, and some of them are on the dorsal or the posterior side. Some of them are on the anterior or ventral side. So when we start talking about horns, the ventral or anterior, it says root is K, contains motor axons exiting the spinal cord. So coming out of the spinal cord is a motor nerve, an axon, all right? And then it has on here, dorsal root is L. So it says sensory axons going into the spinal cord. Well, let me refresh your memory because I had a board last time. This board is the reflex arc, and we're supposed to know the 5 parts of a reflex arc. We talked about it. So I'm going to stand up. And so what we have here is a sensory receptor with a receptor receiving a sensory impulse. Or let's say if I stick you with a knife or a pin, you feel it because the sensory receptor perceives that and sends a signal through a sensory neuron where? Towards the cell body. So this is a dendrite. This is the cell body. This is the cell body, and groups of these sensory nuclei are called a ganglion. It'll be called the dorsal root ganglion. So this part here, up to this, would be outside the spinal cord. From the cell body down below, this would be the axon going in. This is a sensory root going into the what would be the spinal cord. And so this is the association or interneuron. This is in the dorsal horn. And in the ventral horn is the nucleus of the motor neuron. So remember I said you had what looks like a butterfly, you had a dorsal horn. So the dorsal horn would have this nucleus. The ventral horn would have this nucleus. And then coming out of the spinal cord is this axon, which is a motor axon. And we talked about this when we talked about the muscle. So this is an axon going to a muscle or effector. So let's go over 5 basic things. The reflex, sensory receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, effector. So those are the 5 parts of a reflex arc, okay? So if you step on a nail, or if you put your hand on something sharp and you pull away, that's a reflex. Or if I hit your, let's say, tendon with a reflex hammer, it'll move because I'll be sending a signal into the spinal cord through the association neuron, out through the motor neuron, and what happens to your arm? It moves, okay? So let's take a look at this here. This is basically this is the spinal cord. So some of these different terms that we just talked about are on this. Now I'm going to turn this around because I'm going to go like that. And the reason I'm doing that is this is the dorsal side. How do I know? This is a cervical vertebra, and this is the spinous process. So taking your hand and rubbing on the back of your neck, the bone there is that bone. Does everybody follow? So this is dorsal. So this butterfly part of the wing is the dorsal horn. That is the ventral horn. The way I'm going to know this is that there's a fissure, an anterior fissure on the bottom. So on the bottom is an anterior fissure. In the middle is a central canal. And so if we're looking out here, there is a swelling. This is the dorsal root ganglion. That's the swelling. Just beyond that, this is the sensory root going into the dorsal horn. This is where I'm going to have the association neuron nuclei, and it'll be connecting between here or to the other side. And then this is where the motor nucleus is. And then this is a motor, basically a motor root coming out. And so this nerve that's out here has two different parts to it, a sensory part going in and a motor coming out. Does everybody kind of follow? So looking at that, looking at the matching, if we're looking at, let's say we already went to dorsal root, that's going into the cord, and the anterior root is coming out of the cord. So the ventral root is K, the dorsal root is L, the dorsal root ganglion is C, That's the sensory neuron cell bodies. The dorsal posterior horn is I, contains association neuron cell bodies. Gee, I could make some really good questions on this material. Jennifer, I could do that. And Justin, I did that tonight. I made some really good questions. Like for instance, looking at here, it says what? It says the ventral anterior horn, J, contains motor neuron cell bodies. Well, that is something we just learned. So I could have a matching question as to what is this part of the spinal cord, identify it. Or I might want to know, like under I, contains association neuron cell bodies. Well, that's the dorsal horn. Do you see where I'm getting at? So you need to be able to identify these. And so Seth, when you look at the images, make sure you can identify, but what you need to do to answer those questions or know what it is, you got to read this over like 5 times. And you go, why 5 times? Because I got a call from a former student that's wanting to go to dental school. And he said that I changed how he studied for his classes, because he would just read this once and then he thought he knew it. And then he tried to take one of the quizzes and he bombed it. And so I told him, you have to read it again and again, Brianna, and again. And then the 4th time, Justin, and then Nicole, maybe the 5th time. And then as you're reading, each time you're picking up more and more information so that it's kind of layering it in. You just can't read it once. My mind doesn't work that way. So he asked for a reference from me, okay, which I'll be able to give him because he became one of the better students in the class. Okay, all right, enough said. So in other words, in order to do well on this next test, you got to read the hardcore material, the lecture material that we have for lab, and then look at these photos and ask yourself, Corey, what could Dr. Byrne ask? How would I ask this question? Okay, so we have horns, dorsal and ventral. In the spinal cord, the butterfly, if you think of it as a butterfly, are where I have nuclei. And then the white area that's in the cord, these are tracts. So they're carrying, if it's an ascending tract, it's going to take information from my organs and from the skin up the spinal cord to the brain. And then it'll take information from the brain on descending tracts. Like this area is the lateral spinothalamic tract. So it's going from the spine to the thalamus. And so this is the sensory part. You don't need to know that, but you need to know that we have ascending and descending tracts in this white matter, and the white matter are Schwann cells around the axon sending information either up to the brain or from the brain back down, okay? Cerebral spinal fluid is M. It's the transports nutrients and gases to nervous tissue, and it cushions the spinal cord. So a good question might be, cerebral spinal fluid is responsible for nutrition. True. Responsible for bringing gases to and from the tissue. True. Responsible for cushioning the spinal cord and the brain. Also true. Okay, so those give you a few examples. All right, so let's look at this model from the beginning. If this is our spinal cord right here, and this is the dorsal part, that's the dorsal horn, and then this would be the ventral horn. I look for this little crack or fissure called the anterior fissure. That's one thing. Also, when I look at the spinal cord, I'm going to have a swelling or a big group of nuclei in the dorsal root ganglion. That's here on the dorsal side, right there. Okay. And so the 3 layers are the dura layer, that's here. Underneath it is arachnoid. Underneath the arachnoid is a space called the subarachnoid space. And then right on the spinal cord is the pia layer. And you'll see this on the pictures in the lab. Going into the spinal cord are sensory rootlets. They look like little strings going in. Sensory goes in, going into the dorsal horn. Coming out on the motor horn or ventral horn are motor rootlets going into what becomes the motor axon. Does everybody kind of follow? We beating it into you? Does it make sense now? So basically, let's go over what each of those were from the top. Epidural space was D, dura G, arachnoid was F, subarachnoid space was what? Anybody? H, pia E, central canal, what? N, ventral root K, dorsal root was L, posterior root ganglion is C, that has sensory nerve cell bodies, and dorsal horn is I, anterior horn J, ascending tracts A, those are myelinated axons carrying information to the brain. When it comes from the brain back down, it's a descending tract, that's B. And then cerebral spinal fluid does what? M. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, let's do cranial nerves. Now, where are cranial nerves? Well, if you look at the brain from the side, you don't find them. Where do you have to look? You got to look underneath. So if I take the brain and we put it together like so, here's our what? Here's our frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe on the side, cerebellum, Corey, cerebellum, cerebellum. Got that? Cerebellum. All right, good. Enough said. All right. What's on the Trinity? What's in the front of your face? If I'm going to come close to your face, what am I going to touch first? I'm coming right to you with my hand. What am I going to touch first? Your what? Go ahead. I can't hear. So what am I going to come to first? Your nose, right? So the first thing is nose. So which cranial nerve is going to be the first one? It's going to be olfactory. So if you look at your sheet and then you look at your lab lecture notes, there's a sheet that has all the different 12 cranial nerves, okay? And so when you look at it, the first one is olfactory, but my nose is the first thing that you're going to hit, okay, when you come to the face. What's the second thing that I'm going to come to when I'm trying to get to, as I'm coming to my face?
Your eye.
Or my eyes. So the second cranial nerve is basically going to go for vision. So first cranial nerve is this long nerve here. That, remember, in the ethmoid there were little openings. Ethmoid, foramina. These were like the cribriform plate. I think we talked about that, and I said that's where cranial nerves come through. So in other words, my nose, I have receptors for smell, and I got to get them inside up underneath here, and they're underneath my frontal lobe, and so they're right there. So cranial nerve 1 is there, and we work our way down to cranial nerve 12, and they're listed as Roman numerals 1, 2, 3. You need to not only know the name, you need to know what number it is. So olfactory is cranial nerve 1, and so let's fill this sheet out as we go. So under sensory, the sensory function is smell, correct? And so that is going to be in the olfactory part of my temporal lobe. Just put T for temporal. The optic nerve is only a sensory nerve, just like cranial nerve 1. It's number 2, and it's sensory for vision. And obviously it's, what did we say? What lobe? I forgot. What lobe? In the back of my brain. What was in the back of my brain? Occipital. Thank you, Nicole. So occipital's in the back. So just put O for occipital. Okay, so we're going to group these different nerves together for what they do. Cranial nerve 3, 4, and 6 move my eyeball. is what they do. On the motor part of cranial nerve 3, 4, and 6, I move my eyeball. I move my eyeball up, I move my eyeball down, I move my eyeball medial, and I move my eyeball lateral, correct? So when we look at it, eyeball movement under the motor part for 3, 4, and 6. And since I'm using muscles to move my eyeball, I have to remember what part of my brain was my motor cortex. Remember, M is before S. So motor cortex is in the what?
Frontal.
Frontal lobe. So any motor, anything that has to do with a muscle, I have to send some information to the frontal cortex. And if it has something to do with sensation, it has to go to the parietal, which is the parietal or sensory cortex just behind this area right here. Does everybody kind of follow? So when we get to the sensory part of 3, 4, and also 6, you want to put the letter P. And if you look under function, it says proprioception. There's 5 areas where I have proprioception. And I've looked this up just about every class. Proprioception kind of is used for giving me some orientation in space. But you need to look up what proprioception means so you understand what it is. Okay, Jennifer? So in other words, these 3 cranial nerves that move the eyeball, cranial nerve 3, 4, and 6, have something to do with proprioception. And let's talk about the last 2. Cranial nerves 11 and 12 also have to do with proprioception, and that's sensory. Okay, so let's go to trigeminal. And so for trigeminal, the easiest to remember trigeminal, Justin, have you ever been slapped? Have you ever gotten slapped in your lifetime? Turn your mic on. Everybody wants to hear.
Yes.
Okay, and so when you got hit, were there 3 marks on your face? Say yes.
Yeah.
Okay, and so how did you know you got slapped? You felt it. It hurt. There's 3 branches to the trigeminal nerve, 3 trigeminal. There's an ophthalmic above the eye, go to the eye. This is the maxillary, and this is the mandible. So when you got slapped, Corey, when he got slapped, he felt it. He felt it in his trigeminal nerve, which is sensory to the face. So if you go like that, and then you go like that, there's 3 different nerves, and they go together, and they're real large, and they're called trigeminal. So skin sensation, facial skin sensation is cranial nerve 5, and it's trigeminal with 3 branches. So that's what that is. Does that make sense? I mean, it's an easy way to remember it. So, and you feel it. So that's the sensation when you get slapped. If you get slapped hard enough, you'll remember. Okay, so that's trigeminal. Facial skin sensation. The motor part of cranial nerve 5 is to chew. So it's motor. Chewing has to do with a muscle. Muscle has to do with the cortex. And so the frontal cortex of my brain is going to have something to do with chewing. But also, we'll get into some other stuff later on. But anyway, the motor cortex. So for skin sensation, I have to go to the sensory cortex, and that's the parietal. So once you start thinking of these different parts of the brain, it's kind of easy to kind of figure out. So trigeminal is sensory to the face for sensation and chewing. Like this muscle on the side is my masseter. What was the muscle up here by my temporal that allowed me to chew? Anybody remember?
Yeah.
Nobody. What's that?
Ethmoid?
Well, no, what's the name of the muscle that was up here that goes up to the temporal bone?
Temporal.
Yeah, temporal muscle. See how hard? It's real hard stuff, guys. So it's your temporal and your masseter allow you to chew, does it not? All right. Let's kind of get an understanding of cranial nerve 6. when I take my leg, when we were learning muscles, and I brought my leg into the midline, I adducted, ADDUCT, correct? And when I took my leg away, I ABDUCT, I abducted. When I take my eyeball and I laterally track to the side, I'm abducting, right? ABDUCTING. What does cranial nerve 6 say? Abducens. Do you see it abducts your eyeball? Does that make sense? So cranial nerve 6 abducts my eyeball and it makes it go lateral. So we're going to learn, here's an eyeball. Next week, we're going to talk about these special senses. But these are called rectus. I have a superior, this is an eyeball, Jamie, just so you know, that's an eyeball, okay? And external are these muscles. So cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6 move the eyeball by attaching to this white area called a sclera. And the one on the top is the superior rectus. That's the oculomotor nerve that goes there. This one on the lateral is called the lateral rectus. And it's cranial nerve 6, 5 and 1 is 6, abducing. And then this one here goes through a pulley and it's called trochlea. So which cranial nerve was trochlea? Go back and look. Number what? 4. So cranial nerve 4, it's going to take the eyeball because it'll go through a little pulley. It'll move your eyeball down and out. And that's the trochlear nerve that takes care, that does that. And so each of these muscles is innervated by a different nerve, okay? But we want to group them together as well. But you want to know that number 6 abducts the eye. Number 4 is the trochlear, takes the eyeball down and out. And we'll talk more about that next week. And superior rectus brings the eye up, and that's oculomotor. I forgot about number 5. That was what to the face? What was it to the face? He's got slapped in. Yeah, sensory trigeminal. Okay, and then I chew with which cranial nerve? I forgot already. I chew.
Trigeminal.
Trigeminal. So you got to repeat this stuff, and you go over it and over it again. All right, so now that gets us to cranial nerve 7, motor. So when I smile and my zygomaticus is contracting, muscles of facial expression is the facial nerve. So the facial nerve is facial expression under the motor part, and it allows me to taste with the sensory part. Okay, and so the motor part is going to go to the frontal cortex, and the gustatory, gustation is taste, and that's parietal, is what that is. So I said the 7th cranial nerve is motor, or for muscles of facial expression like zygomaticus, when you smile, okay? All right. 8 is made of 2 nerves, the vestibular and the cochlear nerve. The vestibular has to do with balance, and the cochlea has to do with hearing. So the 8th cranial nerve, when we get to it, is hearing and equilibrium or balance. That's the sensory function. Minimal motor. So where is my auditory center? Remember, my ear is where does my ear, it's on my temporal aspect. So I hear through the temporal, the auditory lobe. And then for balance, not only do I need the frontal lobe for the muscle, why do I have a cerebellum? It gives me coordination and equilibrium and fine movements. So I've watched my son, my granddaughter, as she went from doing all this type stuff to where she's 17 months, and she's able to actually move her arms differently because her cerebellum, and she's walking with balance, her cerebellum is allowing her to keep her equilibrium as she walks. But no sooner does she start walking, Corey, than she's running, is what happens, okay? And so what happens when you get older, Justin? When you're young, you have to learn to balance yourself. What happens is as you get to be older and older and older, can you lose that ability to do it?
You fall.
You fall and you lose your balance. So there's two types of equilibrium, and we'll talk about that next week under the 8th cranial nerve. So we'll talk about the cochlear nerve and the vestibule. So that's where the term vestibular cochlear comes in. All right, the next one is glossopharyngeal. Glossus means tongue, write tongue down, tongue. So glossopharyngeal, under sensory, it's taste. And also under glossopharyngeal, it has something to do with blood gases. Just put blood gases. Your pharynx is this area here. Put your hand on your throat and swallow. Come on, Jamie, do that for me. You feel it move? So the glossopharyngeal allows you to swallow and allows for speech. So when we start talking about taste, taste was parietal lobe, you put a P, and these gases, blood gases and stuff like that, is medulla. The medulla is what controls that. That's blood pressure and the gases. And then because I'm speaking, I need this area in the front. Does anybody remember? I forgot already. What was that area up here called? The one in the front. Began with a B. Who said it was blank area. Broca, B-R-O-C-A. Broca's speech. So Broca's speech is an area that allows me to speak. So when they want to know, well, what part of the brain, that's where you want to kind of have some idea where these different regions are. So glossopharyngeal is taste and the pharynx, okay? The next one I like because it's cranial nerve 10. And I don't like it because it's cranial nerve 10. I like it because it's called vagus, V-A-G-U-S. And it's the wanderer. Jamie, it's just like Moses. It wandered for 40 years. So this is a cranial nerve 10 that goes through my chest and into my digestive system. So if you look at the vagus under motor, it's going to control my digestion and the glands dealing with digestion. Okay. And it's also going to have an effect on my heart. The vagus has an effect on my heart. The vagus also has something to do with taste and blood pressure and blood gases. So the vagus nerve is real important. And so it basically is parietal for taste and then medulla for everything else. So you need the primitive brain to control respiration and stuff like that. We're getting towards the end, guys. All right, I'm going to move my shoulders up like this. Why? Brianna, why did I do that? Trinity, why are my shoulders up like this? Justin, what happened? Seth, why are my shoulders up like this? Because I'm introducing the next cranial nerve, and it's called accessory. And it allows me to do what? Allows me to move the muscles of my head and shoulders. You learned it as accessory. I learned it as spinal accessory, number 11. It's also for proprioception, but it is the frontal lobe because it's motor. It allows me to move. So sternocleidomastoid and the levator and the trap, these are all innervated by what is called accessory, number 11. And the last one is hypoglossal. Glossal means tongue. And you check it by sticking your tongue out. I'm serious about that. So if I want to know, is my 12th cranial nerve working? If you can stick your tongue out, Corey, at somebody or to the side, it's working. And so it allows me to talk and swallow. And so because I'm able to speak, I forgot again, what was this, Jennifer? I forgot already. What area on the frontal area for speech? Broca's speech, remember? Okay, so have we beaten the horse to death? I hope we have. Okay, all right. Let's go to page 3. Page 3 wants us to know the reflex arc. And I said there were 5 parts. So let's go over the 5 parts. This is the part that carries the impulse from the spinal cord out to the muscle. What was that? Motor what? Motor nerve. This is the part that carries the impulse from the receptor into the spinal cord. What was that? Sensory. This is the one that integrates between the two, or processes within the central nervous system. It's called an interneuron or association neuron. And then the muscle or gland is the effector. And then whatever detects the stimuli is the what? Receptor. Okay, so this board is on your, this board is in your images. And I could ask all kinds of questions. I could ask, what type of nerve cell is this? And you're all going to say sensory or unipolar, right, Brianna? Yes. I'm going to ask, where's a group of these sensory neurons found? And you're all going to say dorsal root ganglion, right? Yes. And then you're, so this is the axon going away from the cell body. This is the sensory rootlet going into the spinal cord. This is in the dorsal horn. That's in the dorsal horn. And it's the interneuron or association neuron nuclei. This is in the ventral horn. And so leaving the ventral horn is the multipolar neuron going to the effector. So you see how easy this stuff is? Do you want to hit me now or you want to wait till later? Okay. Reflexes. A reflex, like for instance, if, is there anybody here that has a child that you stroke the side of the face of the child? What would the child do? Ladies, if you were like, you have a newborn baby and you stroke, the baby does a, what's the rooting reflex? The rooting, R-O-O-T. What would the baby do? You touch one side of the face, Trinity or Jennifer, and what does the baby do? The baby turns what? To that side. It's looking to feed is what it's trying to do. Okay, that's a reflex. And if you touch, let's say, has anyone stepped on a nail besides me? Justin, you'd step on a nail. You're not that dumb. All right, well, I didn't know it. I stepped on a nail. All right, I did it at my grandmother's. I stepped on a nail. And what did I do? Did I step on the nail and go, gee, I just stepped on a nail? No. What did I do? I pulled my leg up, but I also sent a signal at the same time. It was like instantaneous. What did I do to my other leg? I made it strong so I could balance myself. So it was a flexor withdraw on one side and an extensor on the other so I don't fall on my face. It's a reflex that we have. So a reflex is something that we're born with, okay? And there's different types of reflexes. If it is something that I can control or under body control, not autonomic control, it's a somatic reflex. So here they have different type of reflexes on the sheet. They have what are called effectors. Some effectors are skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle found in your digestive system, or glands like in the skin, sweat glands and oil glands. So what I did is I put an A or an S by each of these terms here as an example of what type of reflex it was. If I don't have any control over it, then it's an autonomic. I have, it's self-control, no control at all. So if I put food in my stomach, can I stop it from being digested? No, it's an autonomic reflex. So A for peristalsis. How about if I pull my hand away? It's a somatic. It's a, there is some control. I can, how far and how fast I bring it back. That's a somatic reflex. Okay. What about my blood pressure? Can I control my blood pressure? No, that's autonomic. What about the tendon, the stretch tendon reflex? Well, that's a somatic reflex. What about my respiration rate? How fast I'm breathing? That's under control of what? The pons and the medulla. That's
Mhm.
autonomic. That's A. And remember the one, like it says cross extensor reflex. That was the one I step on a nail, I pull up here, but it's a cross extensor. It makes my left side of my body what? Stand upright so I don't fall. And so that's a somatic reflex. So my heart rate on the right-hand side, can I control my heart rate totally? No, it's an autonomic. What about the knee jerk, patella? That's a somatic. And my reflex of my pupils. Jamie, if I take a flashlight and I turn it on, your pupil is going to do what? Does it dilate or become pinpoint? It's going to get smaller. So that's autonomic. And then the last one is a Babinski. Babinski is where you take a probe or something across the bottom of your foot to see, which way the big toe moves. All right. So what we've done tonight, we've covered cranial nerves. We have gone over this board. And if you look in here, there's parts of the brain as well on this. We did the cross section of the spinal cord. We talked a little bit about the different cranial nerves and the reflexes. So what's your job is to work with these. And what I did is to fill out the sheet, I took the information from my notes and I transferred it on here and I double checked myself. And so in this lab, you have some older labs that I've done, Trinity, that you can go to at the very bottom of the lab just to check to make sure that the information you have is correct. Okay. So that's about as much information as I have. But what you want to do, and what I did for about 40 minutes prior to this class starting, I was making questions up on different parts of the spinal cord and different parts of the brain and cranial nerves. And it would behoove you to not only know the cranial nerve olfactory as one, but also its name. So you need to know that the first cranial nerve is 1, cranial nerve 1 is olfactory. 2 is what? Optic. 3, ocular motor. 4, trochlear. 5, trigeminal. 6, abducens. And if you kind of go over that, so you can't just do it by yourself. You need somebody else, or at least a mirror. Find somebody in a mirror, Jamie, and speak to the mirror. Okay, and then write this stuff down. Okay, all right. The quiz for this week, you have all week to do it. Tomorrow, I'll go ahead and see how you have done on the last lab 10. So this is lab 11. And then after this, we have lab 12, which is on special senses. So at the end of this month, we're going to actually have the practical. So it's over these 3 labs. So we want to be, as you're studying now, you'll be actually studying for the practical. It's multiple choice, true, false. Where did I take the information? I took a lot of the information from your notes. Okay. So you want to know your notes. And what did that one student do? You said
Read
I
it
taught
5 times.
Yeah, 5 times. More than once. Did everybody get the idea? All right. If there aren't any questions, I will see you next week. Be safe and have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Okay. If you have any questions, hang out and ask them to me. Okay. I'll see you next week. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.